Welcome back to the program. As always, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and like the video. Tell your friends and family to do the same. I want to talk to you today about the State of the Union from President Biden last Thursday. I would do a little fact check. It's going to take a little while. There's a bunch of things here I think that are factually incorrect. His fourth State of the Union, possibly his last. You remember during the campaign of 2020, and he said this many times since, that Trump divided the nation and President Biden's administration would unify the nation, and yet a very, very divisive speech. He seemed angry most of the time, lots of yelling. I think he did better than expected in terms of managing the speech itself, not fumbling, not mumbling too badly. He had some moments, but I think in terms of people looking for some big gaffe, that did not develop. And clearly he was instructed to be aggressive. The word that came out from the Democrats after the speech was fiery. Yeah, it wasn't a unifying speech, that's for sure. He bashed half the country pretty good. And so I'm going to go through this a little bit, and I'll read the quotes and comment on the quotes that I see where they were false, gratuitous. He said, "Not since President Lincoln and Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault here at home as they are today." It's simply not true. Again, a main feature of the campaign here in 2024 is going to be the January 6, 2021 riots, and the word insurrection is going to be used a lot. It was not an insurrection. You can go watch the videos. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, released the videos. You can see what happened inside the building. There was never any risk of the electoral vote not being sorted out amongst the U.S. Congress and affirming the election and bringing President Biden to office. Was never really at risk, ever. We know that now as time passes, we learn more and more about what happened on that day. Outside the building, ugly, horrible, terrible scene for us all to view. Inside the building, and you can see the videos, you can see the police were on the side of the protesters. They were, okay, welcome, come on in. I'll walk you around. He started his speech talking about Ukraine, State of the Union. He says, in talking about Ukraine to start the speech, "Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, do whatever the hell you want." That is something Trump actually said, stupidly, of course, but give it the proper context. He was talking about the failure of members of NATO to properly fund their militaries in the way they agreed to. I remind you, of course, January of 2022, President Biden said regarding the pending invasion of Ukraine by Putin, when asked what the U.S. would do, he said, "It's one thing if it's a minor incursion," giving Putin green light to attack Ukraine. Not too dissimilar to what he's accusing Donald Trump of having said. The president goes on to say, "America is a founding member of NATO, the military alliance of democratic nations created after World War II to prevent war and keep peace. Without the United States, there is no NATO." Since the formation of NATO, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of regional conflicts in Western Europe, Central Europe, our NATO member Turkey, and of course, the greatest conflicts, of course, were the Yugoslav wars, the Georgian conflicts, not to mention Putin's takeover of Crimea, Putin's attack on Ukraine. Not a very successful alliance. And without the US, it's nothing. And right now, if NATO is what it says it is, it should be able to manage the Russia-Ukraine situation on its own without the US. But it can't, because they relied on the United States to protect them since World War II. Even right now, Ukraine is at risk of more losses to Russia because the United States is thinking about not continuing support. Well, if NATO is so strong and all these other countries are so great, important pieces of NATO, we'll let all those European countries come together and provide the necessary military and financial support Ukraine needs to kick Russia off its territory. They can't because they don't have it. They don't have the facilities, they don't have the production capacity. They just don't have it. He said, if the United States walks away now, we'll put Ukraine at risk, Europe at risk, the free world at risk, emboldening others who wish to do us harm. Well, then so much for a strong NATO, which is what I was just saying. He just said NATO's not that strong. It can't survive without the United States. And the premise is that if President Putin is allowed to get away with attacking Ukraine, and by the way, he got away with taking over Crimea, world didn't raise a finger. President Obama, Vice President Biden, remember that? The basic premise is if Russia is allowed to succeed to any extent in Ukraine, therefore they're going to take over the rest of Europe. President Biden goes on to say, history is watching, just like history watched 3 years ago on January 6th. So here he is connecting the riots at the Capitol in response to angry Trump supporters feeling that the election was taken away from them. And he connects that to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He says, insurrectionists stormed the very Capitol and placed a dagger at the throat of American democracy. I'm sorry, they didn't. The electoral process was not at any risk that day. On January 6th, the U.S. Congress met in the House of Representatives to count the electoral votes. That was not at risk. It didn't stop. The votes were counted. There was no dagger. There were no weapons brought inside the Capitol on January 6th. There was only one person killed, shot by a government official. No one that has been jailed as a result of the January 6th riot from 2021 has been charged with insurrection or convicted of insurrection. And yet the word insurrection is used many times throughout the speech. President Biden says, we all saw with our own eyes these insurrectionists were not patriots. It's a semantic point. It's a political point. It's going to be the cudgel that the Democrats use for the next several months when they talk about that date and Donald Trump. He went on to say, January 6th and the lies about the 2020 election and the plots to steal the election posed the gravest threat to our democracy since the Civil War. It's not true. It's hyperbole. There was no risk of President Biden not being elected to president. No risk of electoral votes not being counted. But they failed. America stood strong and democracy prevailed, he said. Yeah, they failed. They petered out. They got kicked out of the building. Easy. Horrible to start, no question. The breach of the Capitol, the outside antics, the violence, the fighting. Horrible to look at. This is a moment to speak the truth and bury the lies, says Biden. And yet, all of us know, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, wherever you are on the political spectrum, we all can see it every day. You don't have to be partisan. You can see it from your own party, those who you like, those who you support. We're being lied to pretty much every day by our elected leaders. And President Biden has been lying since he was a first-year senator. He lies repeatedly. You can go find the lies on video to speak the truth. The videos tell the truth of that day. Go watch them. There's thousands of them, thousands of hours of them. The president goes on to say, remember your oath talking to members of Congress. Remember your oath of office, defend against all threats, foreign and domestic. Yeah. How about the rampant increase in crime in blue cities across the country? That's domestic threats. How about the huge increase of illegal immigration across our southern border involving lots of foreign nationals who don't like us, who want to do us harm? Didn't you, President Biden, take an oath to defend against all threats, foreign and domestic? And yet here we have this wide open southern border, even the northern border. And we're allowing crime to be rampant on our streets across the country because of defund the police and bail reform. He went on to say, voter integrity is critically important to a society. The voting integrity of our system right now is low. In international rankings, we rank low in voter integrity. There is no trust in our institutions because of people like President Biden. He's been in public institutions for 50 years. If you have a problem today with how America is running, Joe Biden's had his hands in it. As a senator, as a vice president, now as president. Respect free and fair elections. How can you respect free and fair election when we have mail-in ballots, when we allow ballot harvesting, when we allow unconstitutional changes in voting laws? How can you have faith? He goes into talk about COVID, and he says 4 weeks ago, next week, before I came to office, our country was hit by the worst pandemic and the worst economic crisis in a century. We have to remind ourselves that our response to the COVID virus, the economic lockdowns, was one of our worst peacetime public policy mistakes in history. The worst economic crisis in a century that President Biden refers to is as a result of the wrong decision by governors across the country to shut down the economy, led by President Trump. President Trump owns this. It was a huge mistake and can never be done again. And so COVID didn't cause the worst economic crisis in a century. Policymakers did by responding in a way that was severely damaging. He goes on to say, remember the fear, the record job losses, remember the spike in crime and the murder rate? Yes, yes. I remember defunding the police, the BLM riots of 2020, billions of dollars in damage, dozens killed, officers harmed, buildings set alight, a raging virus that would take more than 1 million American lives and leave millions of loved ones behind. That's not true. That million number is not true. That was overstated because people that died with COVID as a result of something else were counted as COVID deaths. The real number in terms of excess deaths for that period of time is somewhere around 640,000. Still a lot. Some estimates I've seen as low as 470,000. He talked about a mental health crisis of isolation and loneliness. Yes, again, caused by the lockdowns, not by the virus, caused by the response. He says, I came to office determined to get us through one of the toughest periods in our nation's history, and we have. It doesn't make the news, but in thousands of cities and towns, the American people are writing the greatest comeback story never told. Yeah, that's true. In red states, in red cities, in red towns, but not in blue states or blue cities or blue towns. President Biden goes on, I inherited an economy that was on the brink. Now our economy is the envy of the world. That's not true. I'll repeat, he said, I inherited an economy that was on the brink. Q3 2019 gross domestic product 4.6%. Q4 2019 GDP 2.6%. Q3 2020 GDP up 34.8%. Q4 2020 GDP up 4.2%. Q1 2021 GDP up 5.2%. Q2 2021 GDP up 6.2%. It's a blatant lie. Economy was not on the brink. He says 15 million new jobs in just 3 years. That's a record. He did not create 15 million new jobs. He keeps parroting this number as if it's his responsibility that 15 million jobs are created in that period. That was just returning from the lockdown, the failed lockdown, the policy mistake. He does not get credit for those jobs. In fact, since he's come into office, full-time jobs are only up about 2 million. Most of the job growth is a part-time job. You can check out my videos on jobs reports, unemployment rate at 50-year lows. In December 2019, the unemployment rate was 3.6%. That's where we are right now. That's the U3 rate, the narrow measure. He goes on, a record 16 million Americans are starting small businesses, and each one is an act of hope. That's right, an act of hope, because they can't get jobs in the private sector the way we used to get jobs in the private sector. Because of structural unemployment, shipping of jobs overseas. They have to create their own small companies to try to survive. He brags about 800,000 new manufacturing jobs in America and counting. In January of 2020, there were 12.7 million manufacturing jobs. In February of 2024, there are 12.9 million. That's 200,000 increase in manufacturing jobs. He goes on to say, inflation has dropped from 9% to 3%, the lowest in the world. It's not so. Japan, China, Switzerland, just to name a few, have lower rates of inflation. The 9% inflation was caused by President Biden's attack on the fossil fuel industry. He owns that. January 2020, rate of inflation was 2.5%. June 2022, inflation was 9%. October 23, inflation is 3.1%. False. Fact check, false. He goes on, and now instead of importing foreign products and exporting American jobs, we're exporting American products and creating American jobs right here in America where they belong. Well, that first part, instead of importing foreign products and exporting American jobs, that's on him. He allowed that trade policy. He voted for that trade policy as a senator for decades. He supported opening up to China. He supported PNTR. He supported it as vice president. He owns that. But let's just check the data. Fact check false on this. Yearly trade deficit 2019, 857 billion. Yearly trade deficit 2020, 912 billion. Yearly trade deficit 2021, 1.08 trillion. Yearly trade deficit 2022, 1.183 trillion. Yearly trade deficit 2023, 1.059 trillion. Fact check false again. Consumer studies show consumer confidence is soaring, says the president. It's not soaring. Checking Michigan consumer sentiment, one of the best measures of consumer sentiment out there that markets follow. January 20, the index was 99.8. July 2022, the index was 51.5. December 2023, the index was 69.7. We're still below confidence levels from before COVID. He says Buy American has been the law of the land since the 1930s. Past administrations, including my predecessor, failed to buy American. Again, he was in the Senate this whole time from the 1970s through 2008. Then he was vice president. He did nothing to support Buy American. If it's the law of the land, then we have broken the law. If it was the law of the land to buy Americans in the 1930s, and we've broken the law. Because our U.S. military is dependent on imports. Key ingredients for our survival, we depend on imports. Our pharmaceutical industry depends on imports. Our technology sector depends on imports. He says, not anymore. On my watch, federal projects like helping to build American roads and bridges and highways will be made with American products built by American workers, creating good paying American jobs. Yes, he's forcing this work to be done by union job members. And we're going to be importing much of the stuff we need to repair this stuff. He goes on to say, well, instead of having to import semiconductor chips, which America invented, I might add, private companies are now investing billions of dollars to build new chip factories here in America. And you know what? Most of those companies are foreign companies. And moreover, again, he was senator when we did produce chips here, and he was senator when he allowed that manufacturing to go overseas. Later in the speech, he talks about, it's because of you that tonight we can proudly say that the state of our union is strong and getting stronger. It's just not true. Our state of the union is perilous. $34 trillion in debt. We're doing $2-3 trillion yearly deficits right now. There's division everywhere. Our cities are in collapse. We have massive trade imbalances, open borders, family decay, drugs killing Americans, gun violence. As always, he talks about his dad and growing up at home. I grew up in a home where not a lot trickled down to my dad's kitchen table. Yeah, it was the 1940s. Not a lot trickled down for anybody. That's why I'm determined to turn things around so the middle class does well, poor have a way up, and the wealthy still does well. Well, the middle class has been crushed by immigration and international trade policy, by failed education. And he was senator for most of that time. He was vice president when that was happening. He helped cause the collapse of the middle class. Well, later in our speech, he's talking about healthcare and pharmaceutical drugs and his efforts to bring down the price of drugs for seniors, which is wonderful. Folks, Obamacare, known as the Affordable Care Act, is still a very big deal. Obamacare failed completely. First promise you keep your doctor. That was a huge lie. You couldn't keep your doctor. And the main promises of Obamacare was that there would be no more uninsured Americans. Today, there are about 25 million Americans without insurance, health insurance. 2009, before the bill was passed, about 33 million. And moreover, the key promises of improving quality of healthcare, improving access, and reducing costs failed completely. All three of those things failed. That was the promise of President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden and all the Democrats who voted for the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. Better access, better quality, lower costs, across the board failure. And everyone knows it. Anyone that uses the medical system, pays for health insurance, knows premiums are up, deductibles are up, and medical costs are up, period. Regulatory capture has taken over the sector. He goes on to say, we stop you, referring to Republicans, 50 times before, and we'll stop you again. That is to talk about the efforts by Republicans to repeal Obamacare. And it's been tepid. Every campaign cycle since 2010, Republicans have campaigned on repealing Obamacare. And every year they fail because they make no real effort, tepid efforts. They lie on the campaign trail. And I know because I was there, I witnessed it. He goes on to say, in fact, I'm protecting it and expanding it, referring to Obamacare. Protecting a failure, expanding a failure. Let's just take a look at medical costs. In 2010, the CPI medical cost index was 404.9. In January 2024, the same index is 604.7. Medical care costs are up 49.3% since 2010. Minimum. You don't want to expand and protect that. Goes on to talk about housing. I want to provide an annual tax credit that will give Americans $400 a month for the next 2 years as mortgage rates come down to put toward their mortgage when they buy a first home or trade up for a little more space. Horrible policy, highly inflationary, and buying votes. For millions of renters, we're cracking down on big landlords who break antitrust laws by price fixing and driving up rents. We have a serious, serious problem in housing. Housing has become a commodity, allowed by the law, passed by guys like Senator Joe Biden over many, many years. Moreover, Joe Biden is a supporter of the World Economic Forum, the policies the World Economic Forum puts forth, and one of those policies is you will own nothing. And since this has been determined in 2020, well, it's going on for many years before, but it's really ratcheted up since 2020, huge financial institutions, think hedge funds, investment banks, are buying up millions and millions of individual homes, condos, apartments, to rent them to others. This is being allowed by our law. You'll own nothing, but someone will own something. Just won't be you. Only the very wealthy will own. You will own nothing. We could stop that tomorrow. And I want to make college more affordable. How laughable is that? Since he and President Obama took over the student loan program, the cost of college has skyrocketed, hundreds of percent. He goes on to say, I fixed student loan programs to reduce the burden of student debt for nearly 4 million Americans, including nurses, firefighters, and others in public service, like Keenan Jones, a public school educator in Minnesota, who's here with us tonight. He did not use democracy. He used dictatorial rules, the executive order. Remember the importance of democracy? Well, now when it comes to student loans, the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot forgive student loans. He's doing it anyway. He's passing the burden of the voluntary choices of our fellow citizens who chose to go to school and go into debt to do so, who came out of school unable to pay their debt. And he's going to pass that burden on to the rest of us, taxpayers paying the student loans of people who were not forced to take them out and voluntarily made the decision to do so and failed to get an adequate education so they could pay back their loans. And if we're in the strongest economy in the world, why aren't these people able to pay back their loans? And again, highly inflationary. And then he has a passing line, while we're at it, I want to give public school teachers a raise. We hear this every election cycle, of course. Education is a big, big part of electoral politics. Highly inflationary again. And what about connecting income to performance? Because the public school system is failing across the country. And when public school teachers get a raise, guess what happens to their pensions? They also go up. And most states across the country can't even properly fund their pension system for public employees. He says, I've been delivering real results in a fiscally responsible way. Fact check, false. President Biden has created $7 trillion in new debt in his 3 years. $7 trillion. Our total outstanding debt was $23.2 trillion. Today, March 10th, 2024, $34.3 trillion. He says, I've already cut the federal deficit by over $1 trillion. That is not true. What he's referring there is something that hasn't happened yet and won't happen, is a 10-year projection on cutting spending in the current budget. Means nothing, meaningless. He says, I signed a bipartisan budget deal that will cut another $1 trillion over the next decade. That's what he's referring to. But this is not a bipartisan budget deal. We haven't had a budget deal. We have continuing resolutions. We have messed up the budgeting process for 15 straight years. We're in it right now. We just avoided a government shutdown on Friday because we passed 6 bills that were essentially the same bills from the last budget. And we have another threat of a government shutdown next Friday as a result of the budget still not being done. He says, and now it's my goal to cut the federal deficit $3 trillion more by making big corporations and very wealthy finally pay their fair share. By the way, paying their fair share, and if they're not, it's the tax code he created as a senator. He created the tax code that's allowing rich people to not pay more taxes. He's not asserting they're breaking the law. He's simply asserting that they're using the tax code to their benefit. He goes on, just pay your fair share in taxes. Well, then change the tax code. And by the way, how about the Biden family pay their fair share? He says they, referring to Donald Trump, they added more to the national debt than in any presidential term in American history. Fact check, false. There's no denying that the federal budget deficit rose sharply in 2020 for the once-in-a-lifetime event of COVID. President Trump caved on COVID, I think. He listened to his advisors who were wrong. President Biden has increased the debt in 3 years by $7 trillion. He says, for folks at home, does anybody really think the tax code is fair? I bet you no one thinks the tax code is fair. The tax code we're currently living in is a tax code put in place by Senator Joe Biden. He owns it. He goes on to say in 2020, 55 of the biggest companies in America made $40 billion in profits and paid zero in federal income taxes. Why can't he use current data? Why is he going 4 years back? But again, the biggest companies are simply using the tax code written into law by Senator Joe Biden. He goes on, I also want to end the tax breaks for big pharma, big oil, private jets, and massive executive pay. Okay, those are tax credits he created as senator. Own it. Goes on to say, the average federal tax rate for these billionaires is 8.2%. Billionaires don't earn income. They earn capital gains. And they take full advantage of the tax code put in place by people like Senator Joe Biden. He goes on, no billionaire should pay a lower tax rate than a teacher, a sanitation worker, a nurse. They're not the same cash flows. They're not using the same metrics. Capital gains against income tax. Change it. But as I've said multiple times now, that's on Senator Joe Biden. He says he's going to propose a minimum tax of 25% for billionaires, just 25%. That would raise $500 billion over the next 10 years. That's a drop in the bucket, $500 billion. What are you kidding me? It's less than a month's worth of spending for the U.S. government. Then another part of the speech, he's like, tonight, let's all agree once again to stand up for seniors. When did we stand up for seniors? Seniors are the most powerful voting bloc in the country. They get all they want. When have we stood up to seniors? And again, to the extent there's trouble with Medicare, Medicaid, Senator Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, he owns it. Then he turns his attention to immigration. And of course, that ridiculous piece of legislation that was proposed a couple weeks ago. In November, my team began serious negotiations with a bipartisan group of senators. Call them the Uni Party, Rhino Republicans and moderate Democrats. The result was a bipartisan bill with the toughest set of border security reforms we've ever seen. It's just not true. We don't need any new reforms. We have the laws on the books right now, the toughest laws we need. There is no need for more money to solve this problem. President Biden tore down with executive order the security we had in place to protect our borders that were legal from laws passed over many decades that President Trump enforced, and he simply undid them by executive order. You can go look at the executive orders, go to the Federal Register, you can see for yourself. That bipartisan deal would hire 1,500 more border security agents and officers, don't need them. 100 more immigration judges to tackle a backload of 2 million cases. We shouldn't have a backload of 2 million cases. It's only because you open the border that we have that. 4,300 more asylum officers and new policies so they can resolve cases in 6 months instead of 6 years. We shouldn't let these people in. And 100 more high-tech drug detecting machines to significantly increase the ability to screen and stop vehicles from smuggling fentanyl into America. Stop China. Stop China. And by the way, let's say once and for all, the war on drugs is a total failure, complete and total failure. By the way, Joe Biden was senator. War on drugs. He goes on to say that bill, which did not pass and is not going to pass, it would also give me as president new emergency authority to temporarily shut down the border when the number of migrants at the border is overwhelming. Think about that. He's saying to your face that we're passing laws that allow for illegal immigration, which is against the laws we already have on the books. Just shut it down now. You can't come across the border. You just have to stay in Mexico, period. That's it. He goes on to say, unlike my predecessor, on my first day in office, I introduced a comprehensive plan to fix our immigration system, secure the border, and provide a pathway to citizenship for dreamers and so much more. That is a blatant falsehood. He did the exact opposite. I think the list is about 63 items long where he opened up the border. There was a study done by the Migration Policy Institute, and they reveal that the Biden administration, the first 100 days of its office in 2021, took 94 executive actions on immigration. That compares with about 30 taken during the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency. Only Donald Trump was cracking down on illegal immigration, and President Biden was opening up and allowing it. His executive orders narrowed the scope of immigration enforcement, terminated most travel and visa restrictions imposed during the prior administration, extended humanitarian protections, made immigration benefits more accessible, adopted something of a new approach to border enforcement. And he pledged his support for sweeping immigration legislation that includes legalization of the nation's estimated 11 million unauthorized immigrants. And you can divide his actions into two categories: those that undid Trump's actions and those aimed at acting his own new policies to make immigration system more welcoming. 52 undid what Trump did. On the campaign trail, he promised 26 different types of immigration actions to ease access to the U.S. economy. He dramatically changed immigration enforcement in the U.S. interior, narrowing enforcement much faster than Trump broadened it upon taking office. Detention of non-citizens, illegal immigrants, decreased by more than 2/3 in the first 100 days. In his campaign, he promised 100-day moratorium on deportations, promised to protect sanctuary cities. Again, he was senator. He owns this problem. He owns this problem. In one of the Democrat debates in 2020, he pledged on TV to welcome in anyone that wants to come here. So all this is just fact check false. He goes on to say, we can fight about the border or we can fix it. I'm ready to fix it. He's not ready to fix it. Fixing it for Democrats means illegal immigration becomes legal. It means everyone on the earth that isn't presently within U.S. borders is welcome to come here. Send me the border bill now. He does not need the border bill. He has all the authority and laws he needs to end this right now. Then moves on to talk about voting and voter suppression. He says voter suppression, election subversion, unlimited dark money, extreme gerrymandering. Talking about the electoral process here in America. Yeah, and you're part of it. You make full use of it. Citizens United changed the landscape for funding campaigns, and Democrats are fully on board. Voter suppression, that's referring to voter ID. I mean, as a Black American, I'll be insulted. Democrats don't believe Black Americans have the wherewithal to get themselves voter ID if they don't already have it. Election subversion, talk about election subversion. How about in 2020 when several states, against their own state constitution, changed voting laws to allow for mail-in ballots? Unsolicited mail-in ballots is the key part there. Extreme gerrymandering has been going on forever. Again, Senator Joe Biden. And he goes on to say, pass the PRO Act for workers' rights and raise the federal minimum wage because every worker has the right to earn a decent living. I don't know about that. Every worker has a right to earn a decent living. Would be wonderful if we were in utopia. States have been ratcheting up the minimum wage for some time, blue states in particular. California passed legislation that all fast food workers have to earn $20 an hour. Crazy policy. Always and everywhere, minimum wages result in unemployment. Current federal minimum wage is $7.25. You cannot raise a family on that. Understood. But minimum wage jobs are not the basis on which you raise a family. It's become that because we've so crushed our middle class and our manufacturing sector over the past 40 years with respect to Asia and China. Moving on to crime. All Americans deserve the freedom to be safe, and America is safer today than when I took office. Just not true. Now, of course, we did have the horrible riots of the summer of 2020, George Floyd riots, BLM, tremendous violence, public property destruction, people killed. And it's the Democrats that defunded the police. It's the Democrats that did bail reform. Increasing crime is on the Democrats. What President Biden is doing is quickly trying to reverse what turned out to be horrible policy, defunding the police and bail reform. That's on the Democrats. No one can deny that. It's not partisan to say that. No Democrat should be offended by that. And now they're trying to scramble to stop what they did and reverse course. And so it requires more money again. We already established a police force, and that police force was decimated, both in terms of numbers and confidence and acceptance. Now, through my American Rescue Plan, whichever Republican voted against, I've made the largest investment in public safety ever. All you're doing is reversing the bad policies of 2020, 2021. And here we go. He goes on to say, help cities and towns invest in more community police officers, more mental health workers, and more community violence intervention. So this is social justice, right? This isn't policing. He's not talking about hiring more police officers. He's talking about non-police officers enforcing criminal laws, managing criminal situations. Give communities the tools to crack down on gun crime, retail crime, and carjacking. Don't need the tools. Just more police and better DAs. Just reverse the defund police and reverse the bail reform, get rid of these progressive DAs, problem will be solved. We know how to do it. He goes on to say, as we manage challenges at home, we're also managing crises abroad, including the Middle East. Well, we're not doing it very well, I'll tell you that right now. The little tiny country of Yemen, the poor little tiny country of Yemen, controlled by the terrorist group, the Houthis, the Houthi rebels, has essentially shut down access to the Red Sea. And we, the largest navy on the planet, are doing nothing about it. And we're doing that because he's slow walking the reaction. President Biden does not want a war to kick off, a major war to kick off beyond what's currently happening between Israel and Gaza before election time because he wants to be reelected. So he's pinpricking the Houthi rebels. This little group of people has shut down a massive shipping lane, a major shipping lane from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. He goes on to say, tonight I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the Gaza coast that can receive large ships carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. I want to be in the meeting when this was brought up. Think of the expense of this. And by the way, that's us taxpayers going to be paying for this. Think of the expense of this. So no boots on the ground, but boots on the water, just off the ground. It's an escalation. And as I remind you in past podcasts, aid is trying to be sent into Gaza. The Gaza Strip, tons and tons and tons and tons of aid, like he's described, is ready to go into Gaza. The trucks moving in and out of Gaza in the north and the south being stoned, destroyed. When the aid actually gets into the Gaza Strip, Hamas takes control of the aid. Think about General Adid in Somalia in the 1990s. Same thing. Hamas takes control of the aid as soon as it enters and doesn't disperse it. And there's rumors now they're selling on the black market. Joe Biden says no U.S. boots will be on the ground, just offshore on the water. And by the way, this is a precursor to boots on the ground. Let's not kid ourselves, because that dock is going to become a target. He goes on to say, as we look to the future, the only real solution is a two-state solution. We tried it. Israel left the Gaza Strip in 2005, handed over to the Palestinians. They elected Hamas. Hamas has been in control ever since. The terrorist group has just been awful to the Palestinians. Goes on to say, that's why I built a coalition of more than a dozen countries to defend international shipping and freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. It's failing. There is no freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. The Houthi rebels control Bab al-Mandab Strait. They control the waters around the Gulf of Aden, the Horn of Africa. So just not true. Fact check false. I've ordered strikes to degrade Houthi capabilities and defend U.S. forces in the region. Failing. Slow walking. Half measures. Too focused on re-election. Doesn't want to jeopardize re-election. He goes on to talk about trade with China. Our trade deficit with China is down to the lowest point in over a decade. Not because of anything Joe Biden has done. Absolutely nothing. In fact, Joe Biden has done the opposite. Donald Trump's tariffs, which Joe Biden kept in place, are the reasons why exports out of China are falling to the U.S. President Xi Jinping's own clampdown on the domestic economy is a reason why. Threats against Taiwan are a reason why. And by the way, the exports that we lost from China are now coming from Mexico. Mexico has overtaken China as the largest exporting nation to the United States. We're standing up against China's unfair economic practices. That's a lie. False. Fact check false. It's not true. Show me the evidence. There's no evidence that he's standing up to China in any way. Xi Jinping has something on Biden. No question. He goes on to say that I ended the trade deficit. Sorry, Joe. 2023 total deficit for the year, $1.085 trillion. Not even close to coming to zero. Let's talk about his age now. I know I may not look like it, but I've been around a while. And when you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever before. I know the American story. It's such bullshit. Knows the American story. He's been in the U.S. Senate since the 1970s. He doesn't know the story of America. He's been living off the American dime for 50 plus years. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation. He's part of it now. Remember, he was going to unify the nation after Donald Trump divided it. He's only divided it even more. He mocks Donald Trump and anyone who supports Donald Trump all the time. Half the country. Listen to this. He cites his own resume, and it's all government work. a public defender, county councilman, elected U.S. state senator at 29, then vice president, now president. His whole life, this political world, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, his whole life. All right, that's all I have on the State of the Union. Every day now, politicians, our political leaders of all stripes lied to us every day. And that State of the Union was full of lies, falsehoods, if you don't like the word lies. He was angry, screamed at us for an hour, and did nothing to unify the nation or really tell us the State of the Union. All right, that's all I have for you. Always try to buy American.